Hi, it's Rob. Welcome to this DevOps on AWS video where we'll take a look at CodeCommit. CodeCommit is an AWS managed service which hosts private Git repositories. Now, notice I said Git repositories. So that means that under the hood, CodeCommit is sitting on top of Git. So if you're familiar with using Git, you should have no trouble using CodeCommit. Before we start working with CodeCommit, let's first see where it fits into the AWS DevOps tooling. If you watched the intro video in this playlist, where I discussed some fundamental DevOps concepts, you'll recall that I mentioned the key factor when implementing DevOps is automation. And when we implement DevOps on AWS, we typically think of the implementation as a DevOps pipeline, where we start with the developer's code in a source code repository, then move through the build, test, deploy, and monitor phases in an automated manner. And AWS Code Pipeline is the AWS service which orchestrates this automated DevOps pipeline. And the other AWS services which are commonly included in a code pipeline are Code Commit, Code Build, and Code Deploy. We'll work with Code Build, Code Deploy, and Code Pipeline in later videos in this playlist, but first we'll get started with Code Commit. So here I am in the AWS CodeCommit console, and as we can see, I currently have no repositories. So I'll go ahead and click the Create Repository button, give my repository name, and click Create. Now I have a CodeCommit repository named ccrepo1, which I can interact with and push some code to it. Now, typically, I'd work on my local development machine, but for this demo, I'll stay on AWS and use an EC2 instance as my dev machine. So I'll jump over to the EC2 console and spin up an instance, then connect to it using EC2 Instance Connect. So in the EC2 console, I'll go ahead and click Launch Instance. I'll give it a name and stick with the defaults for the Amazon Linux 2 AMI, a T2 micro, and for the key pair, I'll proceed without a key pair because I won't be connecting to the EC2 instance from my local machine. Now I'll scroll down to the bottom and launch the instance. And with my instance in a running state, I'll select it, then click Connect. Here I'll use the EC2 Instance Connect and click the Connect button. And I'm in a shell on my EC2 instance. Now, before I could start interacting with CodeCommit, I need to run AWS configure to add IAM user credentials. Now, normally we wouldn't add user credentials directly on an EC2 instance, but for this demo, it'll be fine. So I'll jump over to IAM and I'll add a new user named CC Developer and click Next. For the demo, I'll add this user to the admins group which I created, which has administrator access. Click Next and create the user. Now I'll jump into the user, click Security Credentials, and generate access keys. I'll select the CLI, click Next, and then I'll copy the access key and jump back into EC2 Instance Connect and run AWS configure. Paste in the access key and the secret access key. I'll add US East 1 as my region and JSON as the output format. Now, with my credentials added, I can execute the AWS CodeCommit list-repositories command. And we see I have one repository, which is the ccrepo1 repository we created in the CodeCommit console. And if I run AWS CodeCommit get repository passing it the repository name of ccrepo1. I see the repository metadata with the repository name and clone URLs, as well as additional information. So now, since I want to interact with the repository on this dev machine, I'll go ahead and clone it so I could add files and push them to the repo. Now, remember, because CodeCommit sits on top of Git, I can interact with the repository using standard Git commands. So here, I'll issue a git clone command and pass in the HTTP clone URL. And of course, I get an error indicating that Git hasn't yet been installed on this machine. So in order to install Git, I'll first run a sudo yum update, then a sudo yum install git, passing it the -y flag. And then test the installation with a git version. And now we see we have Git installed. So now I'll go ahead and execute the AWS CodeCommit get repository name of cc1 command again. And then execute the git clone. Once again, passing it the HTTP clone URL. Now, here I'm prompted for a username to authenticate against CodeCommit. So what I need to do now is jump back into the IAM console, and then under security credentials for my CC developer user, scroll down to the HTTPS Git credentials for AWS CodeCommit section and generate credentials. Here I'll copy the username and save it off, as well as the password. Now I'll jump back over to Instance Connect, paste in my username and password, and we see that our repository's been cloned. So I'll change directory into the repo folder, create an index.html file, and edit it. I'll add some simple HTML, then save the file, then do a git status. And we see we have one untracked file, which is our index.html. So I'll go ahead and execute a git add, passing it the name of the index.html file. Then commit the file and push it to the remote repo on CodeCommit. Now if I do a git status, we see there's nothing to commit. So if I jump over to the CodeCommit console and go into my repo, we now see the index.html file has been uploaded, and there's the code. Now let's jump back over into Instance Connect, go back a directory, and we'll execute an AWS CodeCommit create repository command, passing it a repository name of ccrepo2 to create a new CodeCommit repository. Now I'll do a git clone, passing it the HTTP clone URL for the new repo. Then change directory into the ccrepo2 folder. And copy the index.html from the ccrepo1 folder into the ccrepo2 folder. Now I'll edit the index.html file and change the versions from demo1 to demo2. Now I'll save the file run a git status, a git add, a git commit, and a git push. Now let's jump back into CodeCommit, go to our repositories, and now we see the CC repo 2 with the index.html file with demo v2. Now we'll jump back into Instance Connect, run an AWS CodeCommit list-repositories command, and we see our two repos, and then an AWS CodeCommit delete repository, passing it the repository name of CC repo 2. And now if we list repositories, we'll see we only have our one repository of CC repo 1, and if we jump back into the CodeCommit console and refresh, we see our one repository. Now, as a final demo, we'll jump back into the Instance Connect console once again, change directory into the CC repo 1 folder, do a git branch, and we see we're currently on master. So let's go ahead and create and check out a new branch named v2. We'll do a git branch again, and now we see we're in our v2 branch. So I'll edit the index.html file and change the v1s to v2s, save the file, do a git status, and we see our index.html file is modified as we would expect. So here I'll go ahead and do a git add, a git commit, and a git push to the origin of v2. Now if I do a git status, we see there's nothing to commit, and if we jump into CodeCommit, go into our CC repo 1 repository, here's our index.html file, and if we look at the code, we see it still has demo v1. So what I need to do now is create a pull request to have the code merged from the v2 branch into the master branch. So I'll click compare, scroll down and look at the changes, and we see that the demo v1s have been changed to demo v2. So I'll scroll back up and add a title, added version 2, and create the pull request. Here I'll just look at the changes again, and this looks good, so I'll go ahead and merge. Now if we go back to the repo and into the index.html file, this looks good, so I'll jump back into Instance Connect, check out the master branch, execute a git pull to pull down the merged changes into my local master, and if I cat the index.html file, we see we now have the demo v2 version in our local master. So that concludes this video on AWS CodeCommit. If you found it useful, feel free to give it a like. In the next video, we'll look at AWS Code Build. So if you'd like to be notified when I add that video to the playlist, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.